23.2 The CPI and other price level measures. In this chapter, we study sources of bias in the CPI, the magnitude of the bias, two consequences of the CPI bias, alternative measures of the price level, and inflation rate. The purpose of the CPI is to measure the cost of living, or what amounts to the same thing, the value of money. The CPI is sometimes called the cost of living index, a measure of the change in the amount of money that people need to spend to achieve a given standard of living. The CPI is not a perfect measure of the cost of living or value of money for two broad reasons. First, the CPI does not try to measure all the changes in the cost of living. For example, the cost of living rises in a severe winter as people buy more natural gas and electricity to heat their homes. A rise in the price of these items increases the CPI, but the increased quantities of natural gas and electricity bought don't change the CPI because the CPI market basket is fixed. So, part of this increase in spending, the increase in the cost of maintaining a given standard of living, doesn't show up as an increase in the CPI. Second, even those components of the cost of living that are measured by the CPI are not always measured accurately. The result is that the CPI is possibly a biased measure of changes in the cost of living. Sources of bias in the CPI. The potential source of bias in the CPI are new goods bias, quality change bias, commodity substitution bias, outlet substitution bias. New goods bias. Every year, some new goods become available and some old goods disappear. Make a short list of items that you take for granted today that were not available 10 or 20 years ago. This list includes cell phones, tablet computers, and flat panel, large screen television sets. A list of items no longer available or rarely bought includes audio cassette players, vinyl records, photographic film, and typewriters. When we want to compare the price level in 2014 with that in 2004, 1994 or 1984, we must do so by comparing the price of different baskets of goods. We can't compare the same baskets because today's basket wasn't available 10 years ago and the basket of 10 years ago isn't available today. To make comparisons, the BLS tries to measure the price of the service performed by yesterday's goods and today's goods. It tries to compare, for example, the price of listening to recorded music regardless of the technology that delivers that service. But comparison is hard to make. Today's smartphone delivers an improved quality of sound and level of convenience compared to yesterday's Walkman and Discman. How much of a new product represents an increase in quantity and quality, and how much represents a higher price? The BLS does its best to answer this question, but there is no sure way of making the necessary adjustment. It is believed that the arrival of new goods puts an upward bias into the CPI and its measure of the inflation rate. Quality change bias. To compare the price of today's cars with those of earlier years, the BLS must value the improvements in features and quality. Cars, cell phones, laptops, and many other items gets better every year. For example, central locking, airbags, and anti-lock braking systems all add to the quality of the car. But they also add to the cost. Is the improvement in quality greater than the increase in cost, or do car prices rise by more than can be accounted for by quality improvements? To the extent that a price rise is a payment for improved quality, it is not inflation. Again, the BLS does the best job it can to estimate the effects of quality improvements on price changes. But the CPI probably counts too much of any price rise as inflation and so overstates inflation. Commonly, substitution bias. When consumers substitute lower priced broccoli for higher priced carrots, the CPI overstates the rise in the price of vegetables. Changes in relative prices lead consumers to change the items they buy. People cut back on items that become relatively more costly and increase the consumption of items that become relatively less costly. For example, suppose the price of carrots rises while the price of broccoli remains constant. Now that carrots are more costly relative to broccoli, you might decide to buy more broccoli and fewer carrots. Suppose that you switch from carrots to broccoli, spend the same amount on vegetables as before, and get the same enjoyment as before. Your cost of vegetables has not changed. The CPI says that the price of vegetables has increased because it ignores your substitution between goods in the CPI market basket. Outlet substitution bias. As consumers shop around for the lowest prices, outlet substitution occurs and the CPI overstates the rise in prices actually paid. When confronted with higher prices, people use discount stores more frequently and convenience stores less frequently. Suppose, for example, that gas prices rise by 10 cents a gallon. Instead of buying from your nearby gas station for $4.599 a gallon, you now drive further to a gas station that charges $4.499 a gallon. Your cost of gas that you use driving several blocks down the road, but your cost has not increased by as much as a 10 cents a gallon increase in the pump price. However, the CPI does not measure outlet substitution. The growth of online shopping in recent years has provided an alternative to discount stores that make outlet substitution even easier and potentially makes this source of bias more serious. The magnitude of the bias. So far, we have reviewed the sources of bias in the CPI, but how much big is the bias? When this question was tackled in 1996 by the Congressional Advisory Commission, chaired by Michael Boskin, an economics professor at Stanford University, the answer was that the CPI overstated inflation by 1.1 percentage points a year. That is, if the CPI reports that inflation is 3.1% a year, most likely inflation is actually 2% a year. In the period since the Boskin Commission reported, the BLS has taken steps to reduce the CPI bias. The BLS uses even more sophisticated models and methods to try to eliminate the sources of bias and make the CPI as accurate as possible. Two consequences of the CPI bias. Avoiding bias in the CPI is important for two main reasons. Bias leads to distortion of private contracts, increase in government outlays, and decreases in taxes. Distortion of private contracts. Wage contracts are linked to the CPI. If CPI is biased, these contracts might deliver an outcome different from that intended by the parties. Many wage contracts contain a cost of living adjustment. For example, the United Auto Worker Union and Ford Motor Company might agree on a wage rate of $30 an hour initially that increases over 3 years at the same rate as the cost of living increases. The idea is that both the union and the employer want a contract in real terms. As the cost of living rises, the firms want to pay the workers the number of dollars per hour that buys a given market basket of goods and services. And the firm is happy to pay the higher wage because it can sell its output for a higher price. Suppose that over the 3 years of the UAW and Ford contract, the CPI increases by 5% each year. The wage rate paid by Ford will increase to $31.50 in the second year and $33.08 in the third year. But suppose that the CPI is biased and the true price increases 3% a year. The worker cost of living increases by this amount. So in the second year, $30.90 rather than $31.50 is the intended wage. The worker's gain is Ford's loss. With a workforce of a few thousand, the loss amounts to several $1,000s a week and a few $1,000,000 over the life of a 3-year wage contract. If the CPI bias was common knowledge and large, CPI would not be used without some adjustments in contracts. But for a small bias, the cost of negotiating a more complicated agreement might be too large. Increase in government outlays and decrease in taxes. Close to a third of federal government outlays are linked directly to the CPI because rising prices decrease the buying power of the dollar. The CPI is used to adjust the incomes of the 55 million Social Security beneficiaries, 45 million food stamp recipients, and 4 million retired former military personnel and federal civil servants and their surviving spouses. The CPI is also used to adjust the budget for 3 million school lunches. If the CPI has a 1.1 percentage points bias, all of these expenditures increase by more than required to compensate for the fall in the buying power of the dollar. And although a bias of 1.1% a year seems small, accumulated over a decade, it adds up to almost $1 trillion of additional government outlays. The CPI is also used to adjust the income levels at which higher tax rates apply. The tax rates on large incomes are higher than those on small incomes. So as income rise, if these adjustments were not made, the burden of taxes would rise relentlessly. To the extent that the CPI is biased upward, the tax adjustments overcompensate for rising prices and decrease the amount paid in taxes. Alternate measures of the price level and inflation rate. Several alternative measures of the price level and inflation rate is available. One based on wholesale prices and another based on producers' prices are similar to the CPI both in the way they are constructed and their potential for bias. But three other price indexes that will briefly describe here are less biased. These indexes are the GDP price index, personal consumption expenditure PCE price index, PCE price index excluding food and energy. GDP price index. The GDP price index, also called the GDP deflator, is an average of the current prices of all the goods and services included in GDP expressed as a percentage of base year prices. Two key differences between the GDP price index and the CPI result in different estimates of the price level and inflation rate. First, the GDP price index uses the prices of all the goods and services in GDP, consumption goods and services, capital goods, garment goods and services, and export goods and services, while the CPI uses prices of consumption goods of services only. For example, the GDP price index includes the price of paper mills bought by 3M to make post-it notes, nuclear submarines bought by the Defense Department, and Boeing 747s bought by British Airways. Second, the GDP price index weights each item using information about current quantities. In contrast, the CPI weights each time using information from a past consumer expenditure survey, but because of the breadth of the items that the GDP price index includes, it is not an alternative to the CPI as a measure of the cost of living. Personal consumption expenditure or PCE price index. The personal consumption expenditure price index is an average of the current prices of the goods and services included in the consumption expenditure component of GDP expressed as a percentage of base year prices. The PCE price index has the same advantage as the GDP price index. It uses current information on quantities and to some degree overcomes the sources of bias in the CPI. It also has an advantage shared by the CPI of focusing on consumption expenditure and therefore being a possible measure of cost of living. A weakness of this PCE price index is that it is based on data that become known after this lapse of several months. So the CPI provides more current information about the inflation rate than what the PCE price index provides. Core inflation rate or PCE price index excluding food and energy. The annual percentage change in the PCE price index excluding the prices of food and energy is called the core inflation rate. Food and energy prices fluctuates much more than other prices and their changes can obscure the underlying trends in prices. By excluding these highly variable items, the underlying price level and inflation trends can be seen more clearly. The three measures of the price level in Part A rise together, but the CPI rises above the two PCE measures, reflecting the bias in the CPI in the figure. The three measures of the inflation rate in Part B fluctuates together, but the CPI inflation rate is higher than the PCE price index inflation rate or the core inflation rate. The core inflation rate fluctuates less than the other two measures.